Welcome to the Trinities podcast, where we explore theories about the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Do you love God enough to think about Him?
Episode 379, AI and I Evaluate My Debate with James White. Several people have asked me to do a podcast in which I kind of review my debate with James White. So I'm going to do that, and I'm going to use the help of some cutting-edge AI technology. Now, the first thing to say about this is looking at the public reaction afterwards. A lot of people have no idea what they're looking at when they're looking at a debate, and they don't know how to judge about which side did better in a debate. An analogy that I've made before is fencing. My son was, for a couple of years, a very serious fencer. And if you just Google some videos of Olympic fencing, it's all very fast, very limited, very specific. If you don't know what you're looking at, in fact, it's kind of boring. If someone tells you there's going to be a sword fight, you imagine a piratey Princess Bride kind of thing with lots of jumping and swinging and dramatic motions. And fencing competitions, it's over just in a couple of seconds, it seems like. Now, when somebody tutors you on all the ins and outs of fencing, then it becomes an exciting thing to watch. Our culture right now isn't big on debating. The kind of things we consider debate are just the idiotic back and forth talking heads that are on cable news shows, or the so-called debates in our presidential campaigns in the United States of America.
You've called women you don't like fat pigs, dogs, slobs, and disgusting animals. Your Twitter account...
Only Rosie O'Donnell.
If you're an academic and you know what real debating is, these things are just embarrassing. They're pathetic. But I think that's kind of what people expect when they tune in for a debate about a theological and biblical topic. They want to see one side get humiliated. They want to see somebody get talked down and sort of get quiet and go in the corner and suck their thumb like, aha, that's the loser. The person talking bigger, that's who won, right? It's just like a clash of wills, a competition of verbal dominance. That's not how you judge a debate. You don't go by which side is louder or more confident or which side seems the most loud and confident at the end. Another pit that people fall into in looking at a debate is they like what the guy says, who they agree with. They don't like what the guy says, who they disagree with. So obviously the guy they agree with is the winner. No, that's not how you do it either. When you're rightly judging debates, you should be able to say that the person you disagree with won. And you should be able to say that the person whose position you agree with lost. It just depends on what happened during the debate. So the right way to view a debate, and really intricate debates really repay repeated views, by the way. But the right way to do it is to score it. So you list the arguments made, you list the rebuttals made, you make judgments about the plausibility of the arguments, and then you make a decision about which side put forward the stronger case, irrespective of which side you think is correct. Of course, one of the whole points of a debate is to help you decide which side you think is correct, or even maybe be willing to reconsider what your position has been thus far. Some people say debates are pointless. It's not like the guy on the other side of the stage is going to suddenly repent right there and change his view. No, he's not going to do that, but that's also wild point missing. Debates are for the people listening. It's a game that lets you hear each side make an extended case for their position and then have to be accountable to the other side to answer the opposing arguments. It can help you be more sure about what you think. It can help you start to change your mind. It just depends on what happens in the debate. Of course, you have to consider in the context of everything else you know and believe. So a few days ago, I did this with my debate with James White on the question, is Jesus Yahweh? I sat down with my writing device and I laboriously went through the entire debate, the openings, the rebuttals, the mutual interrogations, and even the audience Q&A. And I kind of scored things up. What happened with all these arguments? What about the arguments? Were they good arguments? So with an assist from AI, I'm going to give you my evaluation now in this podcast.
Welcome to Chat Debate Beta.
Please upload your debate in audio, video, or text form.
So let me just quickly upload the audio of the whole debate, let the AI start thinking about it. First, some comments on Dr. White's opening arguments. It's interesting that he kept bringing the Trinity into it. It wasn't a debate about the Trinity, but for some reason he thought that that would help him. I'm not exactly sure why, but he based his positive case mainly on 4 texts. A text in Hebrews 1, a text in John 12, a text in Philippians 2, and then one in 1 Peter 3. Each of these texts, he was arguing, identifies Jesus as Yahweh. Now, what did he mean by identifies Jesus as Yahweh? When I looked at his slides, we shared our opening slides with one another a month in advance. I wasn't quite sure what he meant by that, but after I heard him make the arguments, I was sure. So in Psalm 102, it's about Yahweh as creator. Hebrews 1, 10 through 12 quotes some words from Psalm 102. And in some sense, it's about the Son. So Dr. White argued like this: only Yahweh is immutable and eternal, but according to this text, the Son is immutable and eternal, and so the Son just is Yahweh. In other words, they're one and the same. Because if only the Father has those qualities and the Son has those qualities, that implies the numerical sameness of the Son and Yahweh. Is this a plausible argument? It's obviously a valid argument, and at first glance at least, this reading of Hebrews 1, 10 through 12 has some plausibility. The second text was in John 12, where John writes that Isaiah saw his glory, and apparently the his is Jesus. The closest quotation to that sentence is from Isaiah 6, in which the prophet sees Yahweh seated on a throne. Dr. White adds that there are a couple of Greek words in common between this passage in John and the Septuagint translation of Isaiah 6, and he concludes that the author means that it was Jesus who Isaiah saw in chapter 6 sitting on the throne. So his argument is that Jesus was seen in Isaiah 6. Implicit premise, it was only Yahweh who was seen in that incident, and therefore Jesus just is Yahweh. They're one and the same. This is an inference that many Trinitarian commenters do make. On the other hand, a text from Isaiah 53 was just quoted, and arguably it has to do with the glory of Jesus. Dr. White argued against that, saying it involved an odd definition of glory, disconnects the theme of judgment, disconnects the sentence from the rest of the discourse. I didn't really think his rebuttal of that alternate interpretation made a lot of sense. I thought that was weak. And he also argues that elsewhere in the fourth gospel, clearly Jesus and God are one and the same. So his reading fits the rest of the book. Well, there's a lot more to say about the rest of the Gospel of John, but at least at first glance, this argument has some force. Third text is the famous one in Philippians 2. He says that it teaches that the Son eternally existed. I don't think it says that at all, nor does it imply it or presuppose it, but I think he makes that inference from the form of the verb that's used. It is true that Jesus has some kind of equality with God there. Dr. White reads it as many incarnation theorists read it, that he takes on human nature, and somehow that enables this divine person to die. So he obeys God even through death, and he's highly exalted by the Father, and this is to the glory of God the Father. And here, the text seems to be referenced in Isaiah 45, where Yahweh says that every knee will bow to him. So Dr. White seems to be arguing that the Isaiah 45 text referred to was about Yahweh, and that text was reapplied to, or at least referred to here in Philippians 2, and it's about Jesus. And so, therefore, Jesus and Yahweh are one and the same. This is an obviously invalid argument. It's one I've discussed in the past called the fulfillment fallacy. And I think it's a beginner's mistake in interpreting the New Testament. Matthew refers to the prophecy in Isaiah 7 about a child to be born whose name will be Emmanuel. Matthew says this is fulfilled in Jesus. Matthew is not thereby identifying Jesus with that baby who was born in the time of Isaiah. Psalm 110:1 was seemingly originally spoken about a king on the occasion of his coronation. Many New Testament texts say that Psalm 110:1 is fulfilled in Jesus. They're not thereby identifying Jesus with that ancient king that it was originally about. Jewish authors think that Scripture is inspired and so can have multiple meanings and multiple fulfillments. There can be meaning and fulfillments unknown to the original author because God is the ultimate author and God is in charge of history. So appealing to this text to prove that Jesus is Yahweh himself seems extremely weak. On the face of it, he's a servant of Yahweh who dies in the service of Yahweh here. Just saying he has some kind of equality with God or that he exists in the form of God seems just well short of the conclusion that he's pushing for. The fourth text is from 1 Peter 3, which tells us to set apart Christ as Lord. And Dr. White says that there's a text being quoted here from Isaiah 8, which is about Yahweh. So Peter is telling us to set Jesus apart in our hearts as Yahweh. Now, in this part of his opening, Dr. White made a good point about trying to argue that Jesus is Yahweh. It's not enough just that they share some title or that there's some description that's true of each of them. Chat debate. Is this a logically valid argument? A has feature F, B has feature F, therefore A equals B.
No, this is not a logically valid argument. Just because A and B share a common feature F, it does not necessarily mean that A and B are numerically identical. They are only qualitatively identical with respect to feature F. For example, if A is a dog and B is a cat, and both A and B have the feature F, being a mammal, it doesn't mean that A is B, a dog is a cat, which is obviously not true. So, the argument is not logically valid.
Right, and it's clear from his remarks in his opening that Dr. White agrees. So far, so good. So avoiding this fallacy, he gives a different argument than that. His argument will have the word only in it. Chat debate. Is this a logically valid argument? Only A has property F. B has property F. Therefore, A equals B.
Yes, this is a logically valid argument. If it's true that only A has property F, and B also has property F, then it must be the case that A and B are numerically identical, i.e., A is B. This is because the premise states that A is the only thing that can have property F. So if B has property F, B must be A. This type of reasoning is valid according to the rules of classical logic.
And this is the style in which Dr. White is arguing in his opening. He says that only Yahweh has these qualities, that he's to be set apart as holy, that he's seen in Isaiah 6, that he's eternal and immutable. And, according to the New Testament, Jesus has exactly those three qualities. And so, Jesus and Yahweh are one and the same. And this is revealed. It's revealed in the Bible, not the councils. And he says that these texts are straightforward. And he suggests that the only reason people resist this implication of the text, that Jesus just is Yahweh, is that, quote, their philosophy is too small, end quote. So my point so far is that the form of his argument shows what White's conclusion actually is. It's not only that Jesus is fully divine. It is that's an implication of what he's saying. But what he's saying is that Jesus and Yahweh are one and the same. They're numerically identical. Chat debate. What are the logical features of the identity relation?
The identity relation in logic has several key features. Reflexivity. The identity relation is reflexive, meaning that for any object A is identical to itself. Symmetry. The identity relation is symmetric, which means if A is identical to B, then B is identical to A. Transitivity. The identity relation is transitive, meaning that if A is identical to B and B is identical to C, then A is identical to C. Indiscernibility of identicals. This principle states that if X and Y are identical, then any truth concerning X is a truth concerning Y.
Okay, symmetry. If Jesus just is Yahweh, then also Yahweh just is Jesus. The first is true, the second has to be true. I don't think Dr. White would agree that Yahweh is Jesus, although he would agree that Jesus is Yahweh. That's a problem because he's clearly asserting their numerical sameness. Chat debate. Can it be true that A equals B, yet it's false that B equals A?
No, it's not possible. In logic and mathematics, the equality relation, is symmetric, which means if A equals B, then B must equal A. This is a fundamental property of the equality relation. So if A equals B is true, then B equals A must also be true. If A equals B were true and B equals A were false, it would contradict the symmetric property of equality.
There's also a transitivity difficulty here. He says that the New Testament identifies each of the persons of the Trinity with Yahweh. Okay, well, if the Father just is Yahweh, and the Son just is Yahweh, and if the Son being Yahweh implies that Yahweh is the Son, then we have the Father is Yahweh, and Yahweh is the Son, and by transitivity, the Father just is the Son. In other words, the Father and the Son are one and the same. That is logically implied by the Father being identical with Yahweh and by the Son being identical with Yahweh. That implies the Father and Son have to be identical with one another. And of course, that's a traditional Trinitarian heresy. And not only is it a traditional heresy, but of course the New Testament portrayal of God and his Son rules it out. According to the New Testament, the Father and Son differ. For instance, the Father has a Son and the Son doesn't have a Son. So whether you're judging by the New Testament or even Trinitarian theologies, the Son is generated, the Father is ungenerated, there are going to be Father-Son differences, and so it can't possibly be that the Father and Son are one and the same. Chat debate. Can A and B simultaneously differ and still be numerically identical?
No, if some A and some B simultaneously differ from one another, then A and B cannot be numerically identical. This is because numerical identity implies that A and B are not just identical in some properties, but are in fact the same object. If A and B differ in any way, then they are not the same object and therefore are not numerically identical. This is a fundamental principle in logic and metaphysics.
Right, it's called the distinctness of discernibles. So the Father and Son differ, and so they can't be numerically one. But according to the Trinitarian, Yahweh and the Son differ, and so Yahweh and the Son can't be numerically one. They think Yahweh's tripersonal. They don't think the Son is tripersonal. This comes up in the mutual interrogations. Okay, so I knew in this debate I didn't have time to give this lecture on how to think about identity statements and arguments using identity statements. And I also knew that neither James White nor his audience would stand for that kind of tutoring. So what I did is I made my points as the debate went on and let the audience conclude some of these things on their own, because these things really are self-evident. It's self-evident to anybody that thinks carefully about the concept of identity that it has the features that the chatbot just described. Okay, so White's opening had some force. I think Philippians 2 is a little bit of a clunker to try to use in this way, but he did. But I think anyone hearing that opening statement should be suffering from some disquiet. His entire point is that Yahweh and the Son are one and the same, which implies they couldn't possibly differ in any way, even the smallest way. And he said, look, these passages imply that. It's not really clear that they do. That's one worry. Here's a bigger worry. He's just ignored all of the New Testament differences between Yahweh and the Son of Yahweh. If you're going to think these are the same thing, you have to ignore all the differences. But what about those differences? These are just New Testament facts, right? Yahweh sent his Son. The Son did not send his Son. The Son died on the cross, but Yahweh didn't die on the cross. So what about those differences? Can we really just ignore them when we're reading these New Testament passages that Dr. White has chosen to focus on? When the Trinities podcast returns, I skip to discuss my refutation of James White's opening statement. Now let's go out of order here and skip ahead to my rebuttal. What I had to do in my rebuttal was to show, no, these are not obvious implications. And also, it's false that only a stubborn, dogmatic heretic would decline to make those inferences. Actually, some highly qualified Trinitarian scholars don't make those inferences from those texts. As to Hebrews 1, I argue that in 2 later points in the book, he gives a string of quotations, and you're not supposed to repeat his opening remarks as you go down the series of quotations. That would be wrong. On this interpretation, the eternal reign of the Son is still the topic in verses 10 through 12. But with that in view, he's also acknowledging the Father as the basis of the forward's eternal reign of the Son. This is why he's quoting some verses from Psalm 102, and he's quoting them about the same person they were originally about, namely Yahweh, or as we call him in the New Testament, the Father, or God the Father. Further, I pointed out that it's absurd to think that this author is assuming the Trinity, and so the deity of Christ, and doing that is laboring to argue for a whole chapter that the Son, who is fully divine, has recently become superior to angels. That really, I think, is a defeater for any deity of Christ reading of Hebrews 1. Now, on Dr. White's dividing line on March 20th, he commented that in his view, my treatment of Hebrews 1 was the weakest of any of my treatments of the relevant passages. And then he proceeds to read through it, wholly ignoring everything I had said in the debate about Hebrews 1, including the points I just made. It's just like he forgot the arguments that I gave. I can't explain it. I tuned in thinking that maybe he was going to advance the conversation, but nope. He's just back to saying, look, it's obviously all about the Son, so 10 through 12 are obviously saying the Son is the creator. Well, that's not obvious, like my arguments showed. I also pointed out that this is a highly disputed text, and that interpreters across the theological board find it hard to understand what the author is doing here. About John 12, I made the point that the actual subject of the text is the unbelief of many of Jesus' Jewish contemporaries. About his finding similar words here and in the Septuagint translation of Isaiah 6, I said, look, he saw Jesus' glory, not God's glory. Those are 2 different topics, but they're similar topics. Why wouldn't you use similar words? So there's nothing about finding similar words that makes it clear that he's identifying Yahweh and the Son of Yahweh in this text. I also point out that 2 commentaries written by 2 highly accomplished Trinitarian scholars don't think that's John's point here. As they pointed out, and as I pointed out, the text in that passage from Isaiah 6 was a commonly used proof text to explain the unbelief of many of Jesus' Jewish contemporaries. That's why he could put it in here as explaining why there was so much unbelief without kind of bringing into view this whole episode in Isaiah 6 of the throne room vision. As to John supposedly identifying Jesus with Yahweh, I point out that he repeatedly contrasts them in a whole bunch of ways. So far, so good. He's given 2 texts. He says, look, they obviously imply that Jesus is Yahweh, that they're one and the same. And I show, no, actually, they don't imply that. Philippians 2, I make the point that the context is actually not the metaphysics of Jesus, but rather a practical exhortation to humility. The explicit subject of it is Christ Jesus, the man, the Messiah, not some pre-existent eternal divine person. The basic thrust of it is that he has great privileges as God's Son. He declines to take advantage of these, and instead is so humble that he dies for us. And as a reward for that, God has raised him to his right hand so that everybody will have to honor him, and this is to the glory of God. I also make the point that an incarnation scenario would not be relevant to us. You and I never face a choice to lay aside our divine glory and become human. But I think what Paul actually has in mind is relevant to us because we all have privileges of various kinds that we can either insist on or let go of in service to God and others. And I made the point that in a recent, very insightful book by a British scholar, this famous text is understood to be about Jesus' human life, not about his pre-existence, not about some decision made long before he was born to Mary. Again, this effectively rebuts the inference that Dr. White was making from this text. About 1 Peter 3, the context is an exhortation to do right, even in the face of hostile resistance. It doesn't apply the name Yahweh to Jesus. According to our critical text, the Hebrew word Yahweh doesn't occur in the New Testament. It does say to set him apart as Lord. Which Lord? Well, we know from the whole rest of the New Testament, he's the human Messiah who's the one Lord under the one God, somebody in addition to the one God. But what about the words in common with the Septuagint of Isaiah 8, 12, and 13? We see here in 1 Peter 3, 14, and 15. Well, look, those common words don't imply that the same one is being talked about. That's just invalid. So I gave a parody argument. I think a lot of people didn't understand what I was doing there. But my point is just that this similar word argument is invalid. It doesn't follow that the two texts are about the same subject. On his slides, Dr. White also referred to the I am statements in John, and I make the point that John tells you what Jesus means by that. It's the first usage of that in chapter 4 when he's talking to the Samaritan woman. It means he's the Messiah, which is the thesis of the book. That's what we have to believe to have eternal life, that he is God's Messiah, not that he's God. So overall, I argue that the deity of Jesus is not clearly taught in any New Testament passage. That's why Trinitarians have to labor to try to deduce it from disputed texts that are less than fully clear. And for their part, the New Testament authors give no hint of any two natures doctrine. When the Trinities podcast returns, I discuss my negative opening statement. In my opening, I first pointed out the oddness of the debate question. If the answer to is Jesus is Yahweh is yes, that makes it sound like they're one and the same person. But I know that's not his meaning. It's odd that he would choose that as a way to express his Trinitarian views. It's not a traditional Trinitarian confession to say that Jesus is Yahweh. But if Yahweh and Jesus are numerically identical, if they're one and the same, then it's really not a they have to be the same in every way, including being the same person. Remember what we heard from Chat Debate, just a standard piece of logic. Numerical identity demands no simultaneous qualitative differences at all between the, quote, two things, because it's really just one thing. That's what it means to say that A and B are identical. Really, there's just one thing. We're naming it in two different ways with two different labels. So the terms A and B, those two terms would be co-referring terms. Okay, so if Jesus is a certain human and divine person, and he just is Yahweh, then Yahweh too must be that human and divine person. Viewed that way, sure, the debate question makes perfect sense. And yet, many Trinitarians would reject that way of thinking about the one God and the Son. Trinitarians like William Hasker identify the one God with the Trinity, but not with the Son. The Son has to be different than the Trinity. The Son ends up being something like a part or a member or component of the one God. If you're a Trinitarian, arguably this makes more sense. So back to James White. And I wasn't sure if he was going to really clearly argue for the numerical identity of Jesus and Yahweh. So I chose as my target the claim that Jesus is not only human, but that he's also fully divine. That statement is more traditional for Trinitarians. And of course, if it's false that Jesus is fully divine, it must also be false that Jesus is Yahweh, unless it's just like a representational sense or an agential sense. I explained the virtues of the case I was about to set out. I'm not begging the question. I'm not going to imply any contradictions. I'm not going to depend on any controversial philosophical thesis. All right, that didn't slow him down any. And then I explained the likelihood principle, and I gave 2 examples of that style of reasoning. I think the most helpful one is the first one I gave about looking at true crime shows. Then I gave an argument based on 9 classes of facts, which would be surprising if the authors thought that Jesus is a God-man, but they'd be either expected or at least not surprising if they think he's a man, full stop. These are that the Father is said to be the God of Jesus. I refuted Dr. White's so-called maxim with a couple of counterexamples there. God as the ultimate source seems like he has to be the highest in authority. So anyone who's under the authority of someone else, well, that's not Yahweh. Second fact, the New Testament never says Jesus is under God as human or as incarnate, etc. 3 is that each gospel features a mere man-compatible main thesis. 4 is that Jesus is worshipped in the New Testament because of God's exaltation of him, and this is to the glory of God. As a side note, I brought up the reasons cited for worshiping God in Revelation 4, basically that he's the creator. Contrast those reasons with the reasons cited for worshiping Jesus in chapter 5, basically because of his service to God. So they're both worshipped, but not for the same reason. You can argue back and forth about whether it's the same kind of worship. Either way, what I just said is clear. The 5th fact is that Jesus' seemingly divine powers and privileges are given to him by God. 6 is Jesus is portrayed as having limits without any warnings that, hey, actually he's really fully divine. So don't think he really has these limits or think he only has them in his human nature, etc. Number 7 is that the New Testament authors call Jesus a man and give him other titles that presuppose that he's a real human being. 8, Jesus is never called God, theos, without indications in the context that it's being used in a lesser sense. So I addressed famous passages in Hebrews 1, John 20, Romans 9, Titus 2, and 2 Peter 1. And the 9th fact is that authors in the New Testament are not worried in the slightest about contradictions, nor do they defend their teaching about God and Christ as a mystery or a paradox. So what I've done is I've created a high evidential barrier against reading these authors as saying that Jesus is divine in the way that the one God is divine. Now, I think some people who are hearing this 9 facts argument for the very first time probably didn't understand what kind of argument this is. This is an argument that's inductive. It's about probabilities. If you just look at my 9 facts and you say, those 9 facts are logically consistent with the authors being Trinitarians. Yes, I know. They are logically consistent with the authors being Trinitarians. And also, you're completely missing the point when you say that. No! Even though it's logically consistent with their being Trinitarians, these facts are very surprising if they're Trinitarians, or to be more precise, if they think Jesus is fully divine. On the other hand, they're expected or not surprising if they think Jesus is a man. That's why they confirm that they think he's a man over the hypothesis that they think he's a God-man. Or it very well may be that some people didn't think that much about my opening just because it was unfamiliar to them, and so they just immediately put it out of their mind. And it may be that one of those people was James White. On his March 20th Dividing Line episode, he said this.
And so when I'd seen the opening, I was sort of like, oh, this is, okay.
I'm not sure what to make of that. Lest you think I just took that totally out of context, that is really all he said in that episode about my opening, other than that he got it a month in advance. Anyway, go back to Dr. White's constant refrains of assuming and begging the question. This 9 facts argument very clearly doesn't beg the question. It says, what if your view is right? What if my view is right? What would you expect to find? Now let's look at what we do find. We're talking facts here, people. Dr. White, from the beginning, was pushing a simplistic narrative that it's him with what the Bible obviously says versus me and my philosophy, whatever he imagines that to be. In that same Dividing Line episode, he explained,
even before we exchanged opening statements, I knew what was going to happen. Dale Tuggy has a specific approach. I suppose people would say, so do I, but mine is a primarily exegetical approach. His is a primarily, the Bible can't mean these things because of these issues. You can't be a God-man because of certain philosophical issues.
So I guess for James White, apparent contradictions are philosophical issues which can safely be ignored throughout the whole process of interpretation. Well, I disagree. I think the interpreter needs to avoid incoherent, contradiction-implying interpretations if he can. It's not exegesis versus philosophy, it's blind deductions to what one hopes is orthodoxy versus a more careful approach that tries to steer around contradictory interpretations. Now about this Dale Tuggy's philosophy stuff, maybe I should have called White's bluff. What is it, Dr. White, exactly about my philosophy that's getting in the way of my seeing what you think is so obvious in the New Testament? He doesn't know what my philosophy is. Is it just that contradictions can't be true? That's what you're calling a philosophy? Dr. White doesn't know, I guess, that most philosophers don't have a philosophy, like a philosophical system. We're trained in the ways of philosophy. We have a certain set of skills. We're familiar with a couple of different canons of philosophical texts, and we can apply these to Christian theology. There is no Dale Tuggy philosophy. Most of the points I make are just logical points. They're just points about critical thinking, points about making arguments and inferences carefully. No, the likelihood principle in that form of reasoning isn't philosophy in the sense that it presupposes some controversial theory. Anyway, I explained that in my opening. So one barrier against thinking that the New Testament authors identify Jesus with Yahweh is they don't write like people who think Jesus is fully divine, but they do write like people who think that Jesus is a man who has typical human limitations. Can Dr. White overcome that evidential barrier? But wait, there's more. Another barrier is if you look at a standard list of divine attributes, they seem to rule out being human. In other words, there are what are arguably essential divine attributes which no human being could have. That's why it seems like this concept of a God-man is the concept of an impossible thing like a square circle or a four-sided triangle. And the principle of charity says that if we can help it, we shouldn't interpret texts as implying obvious contradictions. James White's interpretations of the New Testament seemingly do imply a number of contradictions. This is another barrier to understanding the New Testament in that way. Is he going to do anything to overcome this barrier? Well, I need to tell you, but I think the answer to that is...
okay.
I make the point that it's not enough just to intone the words two natures and wave your hands and think that somehow these contradictions have been got rid of. That doesn't do anything to get rid of them. And of course, two natures theories, like Trinity theories, are many, and they're different, and they try to get rid of the contradictions in different ways. James White doesn't seem to have a two natures theory. He knows you're supposed to say that Jesus is one person in two natures. That's what the Council in 451 told us to do. But as far as that getting rid of contradictions, he just doesn't care to get rid of them. So I had a little bit of extra time at the end. I mentioned our YouTube channel that we're called Biblical Unitarians, that our views go back to the Reformation era and also to early Christianity, where you find people called dynamic monarchians. And some of those people, we are told, claim that theirs was the earliest and the apostolic Christology, and we think they're right. So that was my opening. When the Trinities podcast returns, James White's rebuttal to my opening statement. Now, when you're scoring a debate, one thing you're doing is you're taking the one side's arguments and you're seeing whether or not the other side has rebutted them. Have they refuted them, showing that they're based on a false premise or that they're invalid, or at least rebutted them, showing that they're counterbalanced by some other considerations that really take away or at least severely reduce their force? Right? You're looking for this locking of horns back and forth to see which side makes the better push. That's how you judge a debate. So in his opening, he argued from 4 texts. I engaged with all 4 of those, and I argued effectively that no, none of those obviously imply that Jesus is Yahweh, and it's just wrong to say that the only reason someone would resist that inference is they're blind or they're just attached to their own philosophical speculations or they're just a heretic or whatever. No, there are good grounds in the text for not making such inferences, which is why you see well-qualified Trinitarian scholars not making those inferences. Okay, so I carefully crafted my own opening, gave a 9 facts argument against reading the New Testament authors as believing in the full deity of Jesus. There's an argument that the concept of a God-man is impossible, and it seems that one should not attribute incoherent claims to the New Testament authors because we think they're saying true things and that they're inspired. Okay, so what about James White's rebuttal for the pro side? Well, it seems that he basically ignored my opening. He just chose not to engage with it completely. It's not clear to me why. Maybe he saw the stuff about contradictions and said, aha, he's just assuming incarnation is impossible. He did say that at a couple points. No, I'm not assuming that. I argued for it. That argument was not addressed. My argument where I show there's a high evidential barrier against taking the New Testament authors to believe in the full deity of Jesus was just ignored completely. So he complained that I didn't address his opening in my opening. I don't have to do that, though. That's optional in a debate. I think he also complained at one point that I didn't address all the arguments in his book. Well, that's not my job in a debate. I'm going to address the arguments you actually make in the debate. It says I ignored key Jesus is Yahweh texts. Not sure what he's talking about there. Of course, I did address 7 texts in which many scholars think the word God, theos, is applied to Jesus. He quoted Ignatius and Melito, making the point that, oh yes, there were people who believed in a God-man in the early centuries. Of course, this is arguing against a straw man. I didn't claim that nobody in early Christianity thought that Jesus was in some sense a God-man. What I claimed is that people with views like mine were there in early Christianity. And of course, pointing out people like Ignatius and Melito as Dr. White understands them is irrelevant to that point. He says that all Tuggy said was that incarnation is inconsistent with Tuggy's philosophy. He just rejects any teaching of Scripture that clashes with his philosophy. I mean, that just sounds like an ad hominem argument, an attack on the person. Where did he show that I'm so stubborn that I reject anything that clashes with my speculations? I didn't argue that incarnation is inconsistent with my philosophy. I argued that the concept implies contradictions. Those aren't contradictions relative to my philosophy. They're just statements of the form P and not P. It's an objective fact whether a set of claims contain contradictions or not. It's not a philosophy relative kind of thing. About Revelation 4 and 5, he seems to say, look, it's just the same kind of worship that's given to both, which is point missing. I didn't say it wasn't the same kind of worship given to both. I said that they cite different reasons for worshiping Yahweh than they cite for worshiping the Lamb. Then he introduced a new argument, which is that the text says that every created thing was worshiping Jesus. He issued a challenge to Unitarians. Do you worship Jesus as he will one day be worshipped? What does that have to do with the topics at hand exactly? Again, he asserts a new argument. In Colossians, Jesus is clearly the creator. Tuggy just refuses to believe clear scriptural teaching. Of course, that's question-begging. The very point is whether the scriptures clearly teach that Yahweh and Jesus are one and the same. And I've, in my 2 statements so far, very effectively made a case that they don't imply that. White argues that I'm just recycling the same arguments he hears from Muslims. Like them, I just simply refuse to believe. Chat debate. In a formal debate, what happens when one debater associates his debate opponent with some disliked outsiders?
In a formal debate, associating an opponent with disliked outsiders is generally considered a form of ad hominem attack, specifically a type known as guilt by association. This is a fallacy where someone tries to discredit their opponent's argument by trying to link them to something negative, rather than addressing the argument itself. Here's what could happen. Violation of debate rules. Many debate formats have rules against personal attacks or irrelevant arguments. If a debater resorts to such tactics, they could be penalized or even disqualified. Loss of credibility. Even if it's not explicitly against the rules, resorting to ad hominem attacks can make a debater look unprofessional and unprepared. It can damage their credibility and make their arguments seem weaker. Distraction from the issue. Such tactics can distract from the actual issues being debated. This can lead to a less productive debate and may frustrate the audience and judges. Negative audience reaction. The audience may react negatively to such tactics, especially if they perceive them as unfair or irrelevant. In general, it's best for debaters to focus on the arguments and issues at hand, rather than resorting to personal attacks or guilt by association.
Chat debate. In a formal debate, what happens if the pro side ignores the opening arguments of the con side?
In a formal debate, if the pro side ignores the opening arguments of the con side, it could be detrimental to their position for several reasons. Lack of engagement. Debates are dynamic and require engagement between both sides. Ignoring the con side's opening arguments could be seen as a lack of engagement or understanding of the opposing arguments. Missed rebuttal opportunities. The pro side's responses provide an opportunity to rebut the arguments brought up by the con side. Ignoring the con side's opening arguments could result in missed opportunities to counter these arguments. Weakens persuasiveness. Ignoring the con side's arguments could weaken the persuasiveness of the pro side's case. A strong case in a debate involves both presenting your own arguments and responding to your opponent's arguments. Judging criteria. Judges in a debate often look at how well each side engages with the other and rebuts their arguments for. Ignoring the con side's opening arguments could negatively impact the pro side's score. So, while the pro side might choose to focus more on presenting their own case, they should not completely ignore the opening arguments of the con side.
Yeah, that seems right to me. Let me ask you something else. Chat debate. What happens in a debate when one side rebuts all the other side's arguments, but the other side fails to do the same?
In a formal debate, if one side successfully rebuts all of the other side's arguments, and the other side fails to rebut any arguments, the side that effectively rebutted the arguments would generally be seen as having a stronger position. This is because a key aspect of debate is not just presenting your own arguments, but also effectively responding to and countering your opponent's arguments. However, the final decision often depends on the specific criteria set by the judges. Judges typically consider a variety of factors, including the quality of the arguments, the effectiveness of the rebuttals, the structure and organization of the speeches, and the debater's presentation skills. It's also important to note that even if a side fails to rebut the other side's arguments, they could still present a strong case if their own arguments are compelling and well supported. But generally, the ability to rebut arguments is a crucial part of a successful debate strategy.
Chat debate. What happens in a formal debate when one side introduces new arguments during the rebuttal or closing statement?
In a formal debate, introducing new arguments during the rebuttal or closing statement is generally considered inappropriate and against the rules. Here's why. Fairness. the opposing side may not have an opportunity to respond to these new arguments, which can be seen as unfair. Structure. Debates have a specific structure to ensure that both sides have equal opportunities to present their case and respond to the other side's arguments. Introducing new arguments outside of the designated time disrupts this structure. Penalties. Depending on the rules of the debate, there may be penalties for introducing new arguments during the rebuttal or closing statement. These can range from the new arguments being disregarded to points being deducted from the offending team's score. So, while it might be tempting to introduce new arguments during the rebuttal or closing statement, it's generally best to stick to the established structure and rules of the debate.
When the Trinities podcast returns, mutual interrogations, closings, and audience Q&A. Now, some people think that, the best and most important part of the debate is the mutual interrogations. I disagree. I think those tend to just be an occasion for grandstanding by the debaters. They're dramatic because they try to kind of show each other up. I think in a debate, really the opening statements are the most important because that's where they put their best evidence forward. And then second most important is the rebuttals, where they try to undermine the case made by the other side. But having said that, I will give just a few brief remarks on the mutual interrogations, the closings, and the Q&A. So first, White interrogates me. Honestly, I thought all of his questions were good ones, and I thought I had good answers to all of his questions. I did make a mistake about a Hebrew word at one point, but I think other than that, my answers were fine. I don't think his interrogation of me helped his opening case or really did anything to refute my rebuttal of his opening case. I don't think it served his side well in this debate. Also, he introduced a new argument in his questioning. This was the dodgy inserting Jesus into the Shema argument, which I quite rightly was not having any of. This is a new argument that was introduced within the last 50 years. Which shows you that it's not at all an obvious implication of the text, and it just doesn't make any sense. So I would kind of knock him for that. Most of the exchanges, though, I think didn't really help or hurt him. Now, my questioning of him, I viewed as helping my case in a couple of different ways. I was arguing that by reading the New Testament as teaching the full divinity of Jesus, and indeed by arguing that Jesus just is Yahweh, Dr. White is implying contradictory and otherwise implausible things. So I asked him, is Yahweh tripersonal? Yes. Is Jesus tripersonal? No. Okay. Then I let the audience think to themselves, oh, they're different. Okay, then they can't be one and the same. Is the Father the God of Jesus? So then the Father's a God, right? Is the Trinity a God? Yes, by definition. Is there only one God? Yes. So one and the same God has to be unipersonal because you just said the one God is the Father. That same God is also tripersonal because the one God is the Trinity. That is a terrible problem for his views. And sorry, but these are not word games. They're valid arguments. Another thing I wanted to do is to break down Dr. White's rhetorical stance, which is, I'm just reading the Bible here. You guys are theorizing. You have a problem. It's just because of your theorizing. I'm just reading what it obviously implies. So with some further questioning, I did get him to admit, yes, he accepts the doctrine of Chalcedon from the year 451, where the Catholic bishop said that you have to confess Jesus to be one person in two natures. Somehow this is supposed to help with his knowing the day and the hour. He seemed to imply that omniscience is not an essential attribute, that it's one that the Son could give up. That's not helpful to his cause. I also think his view has a real problem with the clear New Testament teaching that Jesus is a man who died for our sins. The traditional view is that there's one person in Jesus, and that's the eternal divine Son. And you should think that a divine person's life is unlosable. In other words, God is essentially immortal. He suggested at one point that the human nature is the man who died on the cross. Well, then there would be a divine person and also a human person, if the human nature is a man who could die on a cross, like it says. He suggested that somehow just the divine person sloughing off this complete human nature that it somehow united with would count as the divine person dying. I don't think that would count. So I think that helped my side a little bit. Again, there's a barrier to reading the New Testament that way, which is it clashes with theology and it seems to imply contradictions. I'm just the Bible guy. I'm just reading what it says. Okay, but he admits he believes in this mysterious claim of the hypostatic union between, quote, a complete human nature, whatever that's supposed to be, and a divine nature. Philosophical terminology all around, by the way, not biblical terminology. I talked about temptation, being a high priest. These things seem inconsistent with Jesus being Yahweh himself. He kept using the scriptural phrase, the Lord of glory was crucified. Why does he think that a man can't be called the Lord of glory? It just means the glorious Lord. I don't know why he thinks that helps his case for a God-man in the New Testament. So overall, I think that my interrogation did somewhat strengthen my case. Now, White's closing, did that do anything to advance his case? I don't think it did. In fact, it seemed to me it kind of counted against him in a few ways. He claimed my rebuttal was mere eisegesis. He kind of mocked my claim that these are difficult texts. Of course, they just are. You can just read the commentaries on that. He suggested they were only difficult because of my crazy heretical assumptions. He claimed no exegesis was given. Yeah, sure. He goes back to Philippians 2. Again, he claims there's the eternal divine Son. I'll give him a point for that. I didn't take the time to rebut his inference that the Son is supposed to be eternally existing, like having existed for the whole eternal past. I didn't engage with that. I probably should have. That I'm just simply blind that I can't see that Jesus is Yahweh in 1 Corinthians 8. Look, that was a new argument, and frankly, he just didn't show that at all. It says for us there's one God the Father. Oh, and also there's one Lord. When discussing the Isaiah saw Jesus interpretation in John 12, he says, I just simply reject the possibility of incarnation. Nope, I argued for it. Those arguments were not addressed. That's a hit against his case. I'm just ignoring evidence and using word games. Really? Word games? When did that happen? That's not been shown. That's a straw man to say that I'm just playing word games. It's no good for that to be your answer when I show you a bunch of contradictions which are arguably implied by the concept of a God-man. There are things you could do to try to resolve those contradictions, but Dr. White didn't do any of them. The Gospel of John's teaching, he says, is just simply dismissed. Total straw man. He introduces a new argument that when Jesus says, I am he, or I am, in John 18, the soldiers fell down. What kind of argument is this? He has to be Yahweh himself for the soldiers to fall down? Why can't a human Messiah kind of manifest some glory or power when he says, I am he, or I am the one? I don't know. He doesn't. It's a lame argument. He asserts that a non-divine Jesus can't save you. Again, a new argument. He asserts that a God-man died for us, begging the question, just ignoring that the idea of a God-man is impossible. And again, he's ignoring that divinity seems to imply essential immortality. If Jesus is a creature, then he will be worshiping himself in Revelation 5. Again, that's a new argument. Urges that a mere creature can't atone. New argument, merely asserted. This random basket of points in his closing should not impress the careful debate listener. They do not advance his case. They do not really do anything to tear down my case or my rebuttal. In contrast, I think my closing does add some to my case. I point out that his rebuttal ignored my main points and that my rebuttals were on target And then, of course, it's not eisegesis to cite leading scholars in their field who disagree with James White. About the new Revelation 5 argument that every creature worships Jesus, so that implies Jesus isn't a creature, I gave a perfectly good analogy, which James White later mocked but didn't answer. It's that if someone says that all the Bidens were there cheering on Biden at his inauguration, that doesn't imply that Joe Biden isn't a Biden, or that he's also out in the audience cheering himself. Obviously, all the Bidens there would mean all the other Bidens. Even if you said all the Bidens from Pennsylvania, all the Bidens from Delaware, all the Bidens from New York, all the Bidens, right, but not the guy on the stage. Well, it's like that in Revelation 5. Am I just like a Muslim? LOL. Colossians 1 is clearly about new creation. I called his bluff on his scripture versus philosophy posturing. There isn't any philosophical theory that's implied or assumed by anything that I've said. And I showed in my rebuttal that his texts were not slam dunk deity of Christ proof text or Jesus is Yahweh proof text. That's what I needed to do. And I showed that this view is not based on just merely assuming Unitarianism. That's why Trinitarian commenters sometimes say the same thing. Finally, I end with the point that we Unitarian Christians are not trying to take Jesus down a notch. We're trying to exalt him in the right way as the one Lord who's under the one God. We're just taking Reformation farther than the likes of James White thinks Reformation should go. I thought the question and answer time went well. I thought the pastor who was moderating did a nice job enforcing the time limits and picking good questions. I thought the questions were pretty good. But I thought that the overall performance was a wash. I don't think anything said there especially helped to strengthen his case or mine. I don't think that anything said there especially really tore down any of the points that either of us made. And so I think the way you're going to score the debate will be the same whether you even heard the Q&A or you didn't. And so for that reason, I'm not going to comment on the details of the Q&A. It's interesting. It's good for the listeners. I did make a mistake there. I was asked, do I worship Jesus and why isn't that idolatry? And I burned all my time answering the why I worship Jesus question, but I didn't get around to explaining why it's not idolatry. All I can say now is look at my big presentation and paper called Who Should Christians Worship?, where I answer the idolatry objection in some depth. And I'll put a link for that on the blog post for this episode at trinities.org. Okay, I think Chat Debate Beta has had time now to process the uploaded debate, so let's see what she thinks about an overall verdict. Chat Debate, considering all of the arguments back and forth in this debate, which I just uploaded for you, can you give a verdict using a Texas-appropriate football analogy?
In 1993, the Dallas Cowboys defeated the Buffalo Bills in Super Bowl 27 by a score of 52-17. James White lost this debate by a similar margin.
Okay, that one was fake. But all of the rest of the AI responses were real. Chat Debate Beta is fictional, of course. The AI responses were from Microsoft's Copilot AI, nearly unedited. Now, a debate is a kind of an emotional roller coaster when you're going through it. During the interrogations, you're just thinking about, what did he just answer? What should my next question be? And things like that. When you're presenting, you're just trying to do your best job. It's kind of hard to be objective about a debate. But after it was over and people said, how did you think you did? I said, I think I did about as well as I wanted to. So, it wasn't a perfect performance. I made a few stumbles here and there, mispronounced a few words. What can you do? Now that I've really kind of worked through it and scored it, I do think it was a clear win. I don't think his arguments were on target here. And so that's why I think he lost this debate. If I were to do the things that he did, I would lose the debate. So it's not a personal criticism. It's not an insult. I think when you score the debate, this is just kind of how it comes out. We can argue a little bit about the relative strength of his interpretations, of his deductions that Jesus is Yahweh from those texts. We can argue about the strength of my inductive case and the strength of my rebuttals. And let's bear in mind that a few days before this debate, Dr. White was in the ER. He had been traveling. He had done a bunch of other debates. It's perfectly understandable that this wasn't his best performance in a debate. And I told him face to face that I really appreciated his going through with this debate, even though he had recently faced some health challenges. So props to him for that. Anyway, that's what I think. But really what matters is what you think. If you agree with my side, would you have argued differently with James White? If you're on James White's side of the theological aisle, how would you do better than James White in refuting my 9 facts argument? How would you do better than James White in trying to resolve those 6 or 9 contradictions that I laid out? How would you get around the point that it seems uncharitable to attribute apparent contradictions to the authors of Scripture? Maybe his argumentative strategy wasn't the best. Would there have been a better way to argue that Jesus is Yahweh? Should the debate question even have been that? Debates like this are for you, the listener. I hope you thought this one was an enjoyable learning experience. And if you only heard half of it, or if you've only heard it once, I hope that it does repay further listens. This week's thinking music has been the track Did It and Quit It by Van Loon. As always, there's a link on the blog post for this episode at trinities.org where you can listen to or download that entire track. Thanks again to James White, to Alpha and Omega Ministries, to the Unitarian Christian Alliance, and to Pastor Evan McClanahan and First Lutheran Houston for making this debate possible.
Thanks for listening. We'll see you online at trinities.org. Till next time, don't forget to love God with all your mind,